Om Tavagatamratam Tapta Jivanam Kavivaretitam Kalmashapaham Shramana Mangalam Shrimatatatam Bhuvigaranti Bhurirajana. Your words are like nectar, bringing life to scorched souls. They are praised by poets and remove all sin. They are auspicious to hear, wonderful and exalted. Those who spread these words throughout the world are truly giving souls. Welcome everyone to our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. We are continuing the chapter, the Master's birthday celebration at Dakshineswar, and it is March 11th, 1883. We stopped on middle of page 189. I'll start a little bit where we finished last time. Sri Ramakrishna is speaking to the devotees. Kedar is there and some others. He says, the rishis followed the path of jnana. Therefore, they sought to realize Brahman, the indivisible existence, knowledge, bliss, absolute. But those who follow the path of devotion seek an incarnation of God to enjoy the sweetness of bhakti. The darkness of the mind disappears when God is realized. In the Purana, it is said that it was as if 100 suns were shining when Rama entered the court. Why then were the courtiers burned up? It was because the brilliance of Rama was not like that of a material object. As the lotus blooms when the sun rises, so the lotus of the heart of the people assembled in the court burst into blossom. As the Master uttered these words, standing before the devotees, he suddenly fell into an ecstatic mood. His mind was withdrawn from external objects. No sooner did he say, the lotus of the heart burst into blossom, than he went into deep samadhi. He stood motionless, his countenance beaming and his lips parted in a smile. When Thakur goes into samadhi, we have no idea what's taking place within his mind. It's not our Raja Yoga Nirvikalpa Samadhi, because very often he'll say that, do you know what I just saw? Or he'll be in a certain mood, and we can get a glimpse from that he's actually having some experience. It's not that the mind is completely immersed in Brahman and he's become one with the Absolute at that time. He's in what he generally would call bhava samadhi at that time. After a long time, he returned to the normal consciousness of the world. He drew a long breath and repeatedly chanted the name of Rama. So this is that phenomenon which Thakur called uddipana. If he's thinking or talking about or singing a song about a certain aspect of the divine, or sees something that will trigger that thought, then his mind will go into some ecstatic mood based on that. So it's very likely that somehow he's thinking of Rama, or something about the personality, or just the idea of the divine incarnation, the avatar, is in his mind. So he drew a long breath and repeatedly chanted the name of Rama, every word showering nectar into the hearts of the devotees. The Master sat down, the others seating themselves around him. In fact, he used to tell the devotees, if you see me go into a state of samadhi and the mind is not coming down, try to figure out what got me into that state. If there were songs sung to the Divine Mother, then you can assume that it's because the mind is thinking of Mother that I'm in that state. So repeat the name of the Divine Mother, or the name of Rama, something like that. And he said that'll bring my mind down a little bit. Master to the devotees, ordinary people do not recognize the advent of an incarnation of God, avatar. He comes in secret. Now, Sri Ramakrishna told us many things about how to recognize the avatar. One of the ways of recognizing the avatar is that people don't recognize the avatar. This is one of the characteristics. He gives a very nice illustration in some place that if a boat is going along the Ganges, then they can stay near the shore because the water doesn't have to be that deep, and there'll be a wake. You'll see a little bit of that wake that'll come, and maybe these small waves will come up on the shore nearby. But if a big steamer goes by, it has to be in the middle. And by the time the wake comes, the big waves come, there'll be huge waves. By the time they come, steamer will be out of sight. So he used to say this is one of the signs of the avatar. They may not make a big splash during their lifetime, but gradually it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And after years, maybe hundreds of years, people realize who it was who would come. So, and we see this. We see this. There was a very interesting conversation that Thakur has with Latu one day, later Swami Atmajnanananda, that he said, let's count up the number of devotees. That means the inner close devotees. They came up with 30-some, a very small number. Huh? Nowadays we see these modern-day gurus, they'll have hundreds and thousands of millions of followers overnight, and maybe gone the next day also. I remember a very interesting thing. One of my early trips to India, this will be 1972 or 73, there was a big craze about this Guru Maharaji, the 14-year-old guru. I don't know how many of you will remember that he was considered to be an avatar. His parents really set up the whole thing. A chubby little boy, he didn't say anything really. And jet loads of devotees from the West flew over. I went out of curiosity just to see. They had him on a big platform, and people with these big palm leaves waving. He's sitting on the throne, and thousands of people were there, and a good number of Western devotees. It lasted a short time. He kind of fell in love with his secretary, and they got married. Then the parents set up his brother as the avatar. They changed. But the interesting thing was that at the same time, this J. Krishnamurti, who was very genuine, he was, but didn't care for publicity that same way. He was also speaking. This was in Delhi, and I went to see him also. And he was speaking outside. I don't remember where it was, but I don't think there were more than 40 or 50 people there. So the big splash people are not the ones that have that staying power. Sometimes after many years we start to appreciate who it was who had come. So Lukia, they come in secret, in hiding. They don't reveal themselves, or people can't appreciate them, or they don't know the lasting impact, the tremendous impact. There are many other things that Thakur said about the avatar. They resemble human beings in many ways, that they'll have the same emotions, they'll look like other people. One of the reasons why they're hard to recognize, and they won't care to be recognized. They won't have any of that pride, of course. Anyhow, so this is the first thing he says, that this is one of the reasons why few people can recognize them. You know, there was the theory at the time that Thakur's illness was so that he would look even more human, and that fewer people would recognize him. And only those who were really genuine would understand that who he really was, and wouldn't be put off by this idea that a holy person shouldn't get sick like that. This is one theory that people had. Only a few of its intimate disciples can recognize him. He's thinking of Rama in particular now. That Rama was both a Brahman absolute and a perfect incarnation of God in human form was known only to 12 rishis. The other sages said to him, Rama, we know you only as Dasharatha's son. Then another place, Thakur mentions this many times. In other places he says Rama simply laughed, he was pleased, he didn't mind. The other theory is that all of these great rishis had to be born again as a gopis at the incarnation of Krishna. Can everyone comprehend Brahman, the indivisible existence, knowledge, bliss, absolute? Now, what Thakur means is that if this is the only option in spiritual life, very few people can do it. This is one of the reasons why there's a need for the avatar. The explanation given in Gita always has to do with dharma and with these big wars that come and things like that. But the Thakur's understanding, which goes back to the devotional schools, the Chaitanya school and everything, is that the avatar comes to teach people devotion. That this is the real, and to give them some tangible form of worship. This is the point of the avatar. Because not everyone, this is a rhetorical question, not everyone can comprehend this infinite, absolute, impersonal reality, or feel some devotion, or feel some attraction for it even. This is a rare type of spiritual aspirant. So can everyone comprehend Brahman, the indivisible existence, knowledge, bliss, absolute? He alone has attained perfect love of God, who, having reached the absolute, keeps himself in the realm of the relative in order to enjoy the divine Leela. Okay, now, this will be, this is what Thakur means by this Nitya and Leela. He uses these terms. When he talks about having reached the absolute, what he's talking about is attaining the ultimate goal of life, having some type of realization. It means getting to the roof. He's not talking about that they simply are following the path of knowledge. That through the path of devotion, through every path, if we get to the roof is the place of oneness and unity and absorption in God. So his point is that after that experience, to come down, this is the Vijnana state, to come back to this Leela. Leela is the term he uses for the relative. The more standard understanding that it simply means the play, the divine play of the Lord as the divine incarnation, or the divine play of Mother as this universe that we see. But for Thakur, it had kind of a philosophical meaning also, coming back to the relative plane. So to say relative plane, it's not a literal translation of Leela, but a good translation. This is what Thakur means. And he says that this is the first class type, that to attain perfect love of God after this realization of God. Before that, we use love as a means, the bhakti yoga. After we get there, then bhakti becomes, bhakti is the goal of bhakti yoga, and that's the attainment. And then after that, to live in the world with that same feeling of devotion, that same attachment to God, living in the world, this will be the highest type. So the Vijnani is of two types, Thakur says. The Bhakta, and there we can say the many different types of devotion can be there, but those who live in the world after realizing God as nameless and formless, but coming back, then back into the relative universe, then they go back to the name and form that got them there. So for Thakur, he worshipped God in every possible form that he was aware of at the time, but specifically as the Divine Mother. So it was very natural for him, when he came back down from that state, to look upon God again as the Divine Mother, and to go back into that mood of being a child of the Divine Mother. In his case, after his experience of vision of Mother Kali, we can say, when he was acting as priest in the Kali temple, coming down from that, naturally he had that feeling of devotion, but we don't normally consider that to be nirvikalpa samadhi. I'm not sure why. Possibly because we don't know. Thakur's description of it is It sounds like nirvikalpa samadhi, wave after wave of consciousness and bliss, and he lost all outer consciousness of the world. But coming back immediately after that, he was repeating ma, 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 mother, mother, mother. There's some thought that he was still in some state experiencing the Divine Mother, not going beyond that. We have this feeling because when Totapuri wanted him to transcend even the experience of God as Mother, he had difficulty doing that. And that we take that to be his real nirvikalpa samadhi experience, but even after that, he didn't come back as a jnani after that. Of course, he wasn't, not that he wasn't a jnani, but he didn't come back after that, just I am he, so hum, so hum, so hum. Again, it was with that same devotion. So it's a question of temperament, and it's a question of one's swabhava, one's nature. He had the nature of a devotee, even though he had the highest knowledge and the highest wisdom. So he's talking about himself, really. He had been merged in the nameless, formless, absolute, impersonal Brahman for 6 months. 6 months. When we say nirvikalpa samadhi for 6 months, it's hard for us to imagine that state of mind. Of course, it would come down a little bit. To what extent? To the extent that at least some milk or something could be put into his mouth and he would be able to swallow it somehow. Just that much awareness of the world, and then immediately go back up. So if we want to be real sticklers, we may say, well, it wasn't exactly nirvikalpa samadhi for 6 months, but more or less until the mind really came down again. He was in that state. But again, the devotional mood came to him. Now he said that in the case of others, Shankaracharya, it was the self-knowledge that took him to the roof, the path of knowledge. So when he came down, he had to live in the world with an attitude and a relationship also, but it was the soham, I am that. I am one with that infinite absolute Brahman, and not the type of devotional mood that Thakur or Chaitanya Deva or any of the great devotional saints had. So he alone has attained perfect love of God. We don't get perfect anything, perfect purity, perfect love of anything, unless we've had realization. Before that, everything is relative. When we say we have to be free from desires, we'll be relatively free from desires. But to be absolutely free and have no longing for anything, that only comes after God realization. We read this in Gita, that we can pull ourselves away from something, but the taste and longing will still remain up until the time that we've had that ultimate realization, or even doubts, that we may have tremendous conviction about the reality, but that doubt won't completely leave us, or the knots of the heart won't be completely untied till we've had the ultimate realization. So there's a slight distinction there. So perfect love of God, who having reached the absolute, keeps himself in the realm of the relative in order to enjoy the divine Leela. And in Thakur's case, not only to enjoy, but to fulfill the mission for which he was born. And this is the other thing, that this class of devotee, which means the avatars and the companions and these very special souls, the bodhisattvas in the Buddhist tradition, they maintain a slight desire to work for the welfare of others. This unselfishness will bring the mind back down. For others, it'll be this desire to enjoy this Leela, this divine play. A man can describe the ways and activities of the Queen. This means Queen Victoria. If he has previously visited her in England, only then will his description of the Queen be correct. This is why Thakur was never, he could never say anything that could contradict anything. I always think of this illustration, if someone is writing a novel, they have to be very careful that they don't do anything that will contradict anything in the plot. We can, when writing a novel, you never know if somebody that you're calling somebody's aunt turns out to be a nephew of a niece of somebody that it doesn't work out, because you can do that. It's a fiction, huh? And trying to keep a logical connection, writing a mystery novel, and there are flaws. We call these plot flaws, huh? But if somebody is a historian and they're writing about something that took place and they were there, it can never be wrong. Huh? It can never be wrong, because just recording what happened, not trying to create a scenario that perhaps this happened and that was the cause for this, then it turns out, oh, but we forgot to write that this person was there, he wasn't even there at that time. So this is why Thakur could never be wrong. Philosophers can be wrong. They can come up with something that's illogical. But Thakur could never come up with anything illogical, because it was his own experience. He had actually lived these things. He knew them firsthand. So this is why it's genuine. This is why it's called Shruti. When we talk about Shruti, that we're talking about a class of scripture that is infallible. Why is it infallible? Because these are people who had direct realization. We're in the Shruti. I'm not talking about did these ancient rishis actually hear these hymns that are recorded. I'm talking about those who had that highest realization and wrote about it in the Upanishads and the Mahavakyas. Those who had that type of experience. So this is why Thakur, he had actually been there. If anybody else starts describing something and it's all secondhand, or they're trying to imagine what took place, it can be wrong. But if somebody's actually done it, so this is why he's saying, a man can describe the ways and activities of the Queen if he has previously visited her in England. Only then will his description of the Queen be correct. So if we hear people writing about that Brahman is this and that, or the personal God is like this and like that, we may say, okay, it's all very good and well. This is their understanding, but have they experienced it? Or is this just what they think is probably the way it is? It may be good, it may be very helpful, but when Thakur tells us, then we know that this isn't something that's coming out of his mind, it's something coming out of his direct experience. Sages like Bharadwaja adored Rama and said, "O Rama, you are nothing but the indivisible Satchidananda. You have appeared before us as a human being, but you look like a man because you have shrouded yourself with your own Maya." So he was one of the dozen or so who recognized him. These rishis were great devotees of Rama and had supreme love for God. Presently, some devotees from Konnagar arrived, singing kirtan to the accompaniment of drums and cymbals. As they reached the northeast veranda of Sri Ramakrishna's room, people were always arranging for kirtan groups to come. I don't think it was the temple people necessarily, devotees. There would be these little kirtan parties, sampradayas they would call them, or dulls. Anyhow, they could be hired and they would come and they would sing kirtan. Sometimes Thakur liked them, sometimes he said, not so good. There was one case where some were singing kirtan and Thakur didn't feel too inspired, then somebody else comes and starts singing, gets up immediately, dances and everything. But he was so fond of kirtan. And these are the scenes that we like to imagine, that Thakur would get up. And kirtan, generally there's a group, a procession, that people will go and maybe dance in a circle, singing and everything, but Thakur would be in the middle. Who is he going to follow? He's not aware of anything, but in some ecstatic mood, up there dancing like that, and the others are in a circle around him. It happens so often. And to try to imagine what that was like. His room was small. It's not a large room. The 2 cots are there and everything, so there can't be more than maybe a dozen people at a time doing that. But what a sight it must have been. Presently, some devotees from Konnagar arrived, singing kirtan to the accompaniment of drums and cymbals. Konnagar is not far from Dakshineswar, huh? Anybody know? A little bit north? or something. Anyhow, we read very often of devotees coming from there. As they reached the northeast veranda of Sri Ramakrishna's room, the master joined in the music, dancing with them, intoxicated with divine joy. So yeah, sometimes it would take place from the veranda, there'll be a little more room. Now and then he went into samadhi, standing still as a statue. While he was in one of these states of divine unconsciousness, the devotees put thick garlands of jasmine around his neck. Remember, it's his birthday. So they especially came to show their love and respect to him that day. The enchanting form of the master reminded the devotees of Chaitanya, another incarnation of God. When M came the very first day, you'll remember he writes that two scenes came into his mind. He said, it's as if I've come to the spot where Shukadeva is reciting the Bhagavata to King Parikshit, or where Chaitanya Deva is there surrounded by all of the devotees. So these were very apt illustrations. The enchanting form of the master reminded the devotees of Chaitanya, another incarnation of God. The master passed alternately through three moods of divine consciousness. And this is something that Thakur used to attribute to Chaitanya Deva. The similarities between Sri Ramakrishna and Chaitanya Deva are really remarkable. That the devotional moods that Chaitanya Deva had, the different states of consciousness that he had, the different physical manifestations of prema and mahabhava and all of that he underwent, the burning sensation, all of that. Thakur had all of those things. So they really, and Thakur felt, I mean, we hear him say very often, he who was Rama, he who was Krishna. He included Chaitanya Deva in that also. That one time they were discussing that Keshav, that somebody was saying that oh Keshav, you should declare yourself as Chaitanya Deva, and that I forget, Shivnath will be Nityananda, something like that. And then it pointed to Sri Ramakrishna and said, well then who is he? And in his humility and half teasing, he said, who am I? I am the dust of your feet, something like that. But then Narendra, Swami Vivekananda, he says in one place, but we heard the master say that in him, Chaitanya, Nityananda, and Advaita were all manifest. So he had some feeling that this Chaitanya Deva was that same divine incarnation, even though initially he didn't. We know that story that he went to Navadvip, and he was so convinced of his intuitive powers that he felt if this Chaitanya Deva really had been an avatar, that he would feel it, or have some vision, something would happen. And he went to the holy place and didn't feel anything. Then, as he was in a different area, and apparently they say that the Ganga had moved a little bit there. When he was there, he had, on the boat, he had this vision of these two boys with golden complexion that he knew were Chaitanya Deva and Nityananda. And from that time onward, he was convinced. And these visions, they all would merge within his body. It's a very wonderful type of experience that it happened almost all the time. That you have a vision, the vision would approach him and merge within him, and he would lose the outer consciousness. So he had that feeling. And the same thing with Christ after his experience, where at this time it wasn't so much a vision, but seeing this painting of the mother and child, that these rays of light came out and entered into him. And he felt that Christ was also a divine incarnation. So these three moods of divine consciousness, the inmost, when he completely lost all knowledge of the outer world, the semi-conscious, when he danced with the devotees in an ecstasy of love, and the conscious, when he joined them in loud singing. It was indeed a sight for the gods to see the master standing motionless in samadhi, with fragrant garlands hanging from his neck, his countenance beaming with love, and the devotees singing and dancing around him. When it was time for his noon meal, Sri Ramakrishna put on a new yellow cloth and sat on the small couch. So he became Pitambar. We have all these images of Sri Krishna with a dark blue complexion and wearing a yellow cloth, and Radha with a golden complexion wearing a blue cloth. The two of them were kind of reverse images of each other and kind of complementing each other. After his meal, Sri Ramakrishna rested a little on the small couch, inside and outside his room, crowded with devotees. They had come for his birthday. Among them, a crowd of the devotees, among them Kedar, Suresh, Ram, Manomohan, Girindra, Rakal, Bhavanat, and M. Rakal's father was also present. So we've already been introduced to all of these. This Girindra, the only thing special about him, anybody know? You know, when Thakur, almost all of his most important teachings, he cites other people. He'll say, this I heard from this Sadhu in Rishikesh, this I heard from Tarelkyanath, or Taranga Swami. He will almost always quote somebody. And this idea of giving a twist, turning your passions towards God, he says, I heard this from this Girindra. Otherwise, we don't know too much about him. He is not somebody who plays a very major role, as far as we can tell, in Thakur's life. Rakal's father was present. Rakal's father, why was he present that day? We don't know exactly. He was a worldly man and well-to-do, and he had married a second time and was not very happy, and had arranged the marriage for his son, Rakal, of course. Was not very happy that Rakal, who had just gotten married, was spending so much time there and wanted to live there. And of course, they thought that he'll become a monk sometime. And Thakur wanted him to come, and he liked to flatter him a little bit. And he said if he comes and he sees that other well-to-do people are here, business people and deputy magistrates and everything, that he won't mind so much that Rakal is coming. So his father, gradually, I think, must have developed some devotion to Thakur, but he's here mostly just, I think, to see what the real situation is and who is this madman that Rakal wants to stay with. Avamni was seated in the room. Vaishnava Goswami, this means a family person who belongs to the Chaitanya group, who is a direct descendant of one of the Goswamis, mostly Advaita Goswami, probably. I don't know how many others. It could be from Vishnu Priya's line. There's several different lines that it could be. But Thakur had great respect for the Goswamis. They were the real keepers of the Vaishnava faith in Bengal, and they were the gurus. The Vaishnava tradition that came from Chaitanya Deva, it's interesting because he was such a staunch sannyasin and put so much emphasis on renunciation, but the gurus of the order were the householders. And Thakur had great regard and respect for them. And if any of the Goswamis said, now we feel like giving up everything, he said, no, that this is your role is different, that it's through the family traditions that this Vaishnava faith has remained strong. On the other hand, he felt that they were often a little too one-sided. So we find him very often trying to expand their view and be a little more liberal. The master said to the Goswami, well, what do you say? What is the way? He half testing him and half giving him an opportunity to give a good answer that would be helpful for the others, and also showing respect to him. Goswami, sir, the chanting of God's name is enough. This, of course, is the main teaching of Chaitanya Deva, this repeating the name of God. The scriptures emphasize the sanctity of God's name for the Kali Yuga. Thakur also said this, but Thakur was so much wider and vaster in his understanding and thinking. And he's always trying to expand people's understanding of things. Master, yes, there's no doubt about the sanctity of God's name, but he's always going to add a but to things. That means that, but don't make it so narrow, don't make it so limited, and understand that just mere repetition won't be enough. So he says, but can a mere name achieve anything without the yearning love of the devotee behind it? In another place, he says, without knowing the meaning of the name, who we're referring to, who is the... So he's saying that there has to be a little bit of jnana connected with bhakti, that if we want to get the full fruits of it. But here he's talking about this, the yearning of the devotee. But can a mere name achieve anything without the yearning love of the devotee behind it? One should feel great restlessness of soul for the vision of God. This was emphasized by Thakur so much that we can almost say that this was his main teaching. If we want to boil everything down to one thing, that he's asked so many times, what do we need to do to realize God? What is the way? And he'll give so many different answers, but ultimately his real answer, even though he doesn't say it, in many of these lists that we have, he'll say Holy Company and all of this, but this is this vyakulita. This is the one thing, vyakulita, this restless agony of heart and tremendous longing for God realization. Now, why doesn't he always mention that, number one? Because all of the other things are means to realize God through this yearning. So if he's telling people to pray, why do we pray? So that yearning will increase. Why do we do japa? So that yearning will increase. Why do we keep holy company? So that yearning will increase. So for him, in one sense, everything is secondary to this yearning. All of our spiritual practices are meant to give us a feeling of restlessness, almost hopelessness. That unless God's grace comes and we don't realize God, this life is wasted. That it's all meant for that. So it's really a kind of twisting everything, turning everything upside down. Why do we meditate? Almost to fail. Almost to reach the point to say, no, I can't do it. I can't control the mind. And unless you reveal yourself to me, I'm hopeless, what can I do? And that yearning increases, and then something happens. So, yeah, the very important statement that Thakur makes one time. He says, sadhana, what is the purpose of sadhana? That means every aspect of spiritual practice. He says the purpose of sadhana is to increase this vyakulita, this longing, intense longing for God realization, and it's that intense longing which will yield God realization. So that's the causal link, really. Everything else is a link prior to that. So this vyakulita, this is the last stage, and everything leads up to it. So he's saying, good, repeat the name of God, but let there be some intensity and some longing behind it. Not just to do it as a type of enjoyment or anything. Yes, there's no doubt about the sanctity of God's name, but can a mere name achieve anything without the yearning love of the devotee behind it? One should feel great restlessness of soul for the vision of God. Suppose a man repeats the name of God mechanically while his mind is absorbed in lust and gold. Can he achieve anything? Mere muttering of magic words doesn't cure one of the pain of a spider or scorpion sting. one must also apply the smoke of burning cow dung. Now, this is just some village type of cure, but what he's saying is that if you only do the half of it, then you won't get the real result of it. So repeating the name is okay. It'll have an effect. Holy Mother says whether you get pushed in the water or dive in the water, you'll get wet. Either way, we do it mechanically, it'll have some effect. But if we really want God realization, then that longing has to be there added to it. Goswami. But what about Ajamila? Ajamila, this is a story from probably Bhagavata, I don't know, one of the Puranas. He says, what about Ajamila? He was a great sinner. There was no sin he had not indulged in, but he uttered the name of Narayana on his deathbed, calling his son, who also had that name, and thus he was liberated. This is a story that he had done all sorts of things. He wasn't a good person, really. But just, it's very common, of course, in India to name a child to give it the name of God. Partly for the sake of the child, partly for the sake of the parents. At least they'll repeat the name of God when they call the child. But also the child will also have some feeling of sacredness hearing his own name. So the thing was, on his deathbed, he happened to call his son, whose name was Narayana, which is the name of God, and because he had mentioned the name of God before he passed away, then he got liberation. Now, can we play a trick on God like that, or can it happen accidentally like that? The story is told so that we get faith in the name of God. This is the real purpose behind it. It's not to say that this is a trick. We can do anything that we want, lead any type of life, have no devotion whatsoever, and the last minute just say Narayana and we'll get liberation. That it doesn't work that way. So how will Thakur explain this? He says, perhaps Ajamila had done many spiritual things in his past birth. So he's trying to say, okay, but don't misunderstand the point of this story. It's meant to show how the power behind the name of God. But don't think that you can do whatever you want, lead any type of life, and then just mention it at the end. Perhaps he had led a very pure life before, and was a yoga prashta, for some reason had to be born again. And at the end, these samskaras came back, and that real longing for God came back, and it wasn't just by coincidence. It is also said that he once practiced austerity. Besides, those were the last moments of his life. If we lead a very impure type of life, but get it, what they call deathbed conversion. If it's genuine, then it'll work. If at the very end, we really do, for some reason, look back on our lives and say, that was all trash and rubbish and I wasted it and everything. Now I see that I have no desire but God, and we repeat the name of God. Yeah, why not? Will it come to everybody? No, of course not. But, so this is what Thakur was saying. There must be some other explanation for it. If he really had been a very wicked person with lots of bad karma, very rajasic and tamasic, just calling out the name of his son won't be enough. What is the use of giving an elephant a bath? It will cover itself with dirt and dust again and become its former self. This is a great warning to us. We may lead a very pure and holy life. At the very end, if that hasn't developed into the type of character and samskaras and everything that'll be permanent with us. So at the very end, if we say that now really I understand that I regret I didn't have enough enjoyment in life and this is what I really want, then what good was it? What good was it? So the elephant, you give the elephant a bath, you take it right to the stable so it can't get dirty again. You give it a chance to roll around in the mud, then the bath was a waste of time. Now, of course, we don't want to say our spiritual practice will be a waste of time, but it has to be seen to the very end. But if someone removes the dust from its body and gives it a bath just before it enters the stable, then the elephant remains clean. There's tremendous importance given to the state of mind at the time of death in the Vedantic tradition. And this is what determines what the future life will be. But the real idea is that that final thought will not be something in our control. It'll be the sum total of our whole lifetime. All of the different things that we've done. There's something called a vector theory in mathematics, that all different forces come with different angles and everything, but they can meet together and be a sum total of that force in one particular angle. So the vector theory, that sum total of our lifetime will determine that very final thought, or that very final emotional attitude that we have. That'll determine what type of realization we have, or liberation, or rebirth, or anything. Suppose a man becomes pure by chanting the holy name of God, but immediately afterwards commits many sins. He has no strength of mind. He doesn't take a vow not to repeat his sins. A bath in the Ganges undoubtedly absolves one of all sins, but what does that avail? They say that the sins perch on the trees along the bank of the Ganges. No sooner does the man come back from the holy waters than the old sins jump on his shoulders from the trees. All left. The same old sins take possession of him again. He is hardly out of the water before they fall upon him. There are no tricks that we can use. Not that we can do whatever we want and keep repeating the name of God and go back and do the same old nonsense. These things don't work, because the old sins, that means the old samskaras will come back, our old way of thinking and everything. Some type of real transformation has to take place, and it can take place, of course, through the chanting of God's name, if it is done with sincerity, and if it's done with some real longing and with some love of God behind it. There's one way of looking at spiritual life. It's all preparing for the moment of death. This is the summation of the whole lifetime. Whatever that real longing of the heart is, that this is what will come at the end. We sometimes think that how is it possible for Holy Mother or Thakur to say that you'll get, if you don't do a spiritual practice now, you can still get liberation at the moment of death. We think, how is it possible? But when faced with death, think how our perspective and priorities will change. When faced with that prospect that and now we can't think about when will I have my next enjoyment, that some real transformation can take place. And those who have real devotion, they can, at that very final moment, really feel that, no, I have no other desire. There's nothing that I care for in this world. It can happen that way. We wonder how people dying in Varanasi, in Kashi, how is it possible that whoever dies there will have liberation? When they say that unless you're free from all desire, you'll be born again. Well, the answer is obvious, that those who die there at the very end, somehow the mind will be lifted above, if we accept that, of course. And both will be true, that they'll be free from all desires and they'll get their liberation. I forget, I mentioned it in one of the classes, that one of our monks was in Kashi, there in his old age, ready to die, and one of the young monks came and asked him, do you really believe that whoever dies in Kashi will get liberation, when they say that you don't get liberation unless all of your desires are fulfilled? And then he scolded him and said, you fellow, here I've come at the very end of my life to get liberation, and you're putting this question to me. And then he laughed and he said, both things are true. That yes, liberation will come, but only because dying here at the very end, with the holy atmosphere and everything, that all these desires will be gone also. So both can be true at the same time. And of course, we see Thakur's vision, that Shiva on one side, Mother on the other side, and one untying all the bonds, cutting the chains, and Shiva giving this liberation mantra, that liberation comes that way. Therefore I say, chant the name of God, and with it, pray to him that you may have love for him. Now, he's telling all of this to the Goswami. Goswami made a simple statement. This isn't to chastise the Goswami that you should have said something else. This is for the benefit of the devotees. The Goswami, for all we know, is a highly pious person, most likely, with great love of God also. But this is just so everyone else will understand. Therefore I say, chant the name of God, and with it pray to him that you may have love for him. Pray to God that your attachment to such transitory things as wealth, name, and creature comforts may become less and less every day. To the Goswami, with sincerity and earnestness, one can realize God through all religions. There's always this question that what are the prerequisites for God realization, or even for following a spiritual path? This question of adhikar, that for the jnani, that the jnani has to have tremendous dispassion and non-attachment to the world, not much body consciousness, not seeing things as very real, in a dream. All of these different things are put there, or they have to have a study of the scriptures, go through this and this and this. Now, what Thakur is saying is that there are two prerequisites in spiritual life, especially for the path of devotion. Path of knowledge, of course, if we want to say this world is unreal, I am he, there may be other things, but these are the two things, and if we can appreciate these two things, then it'll be tremendously helpful for us. Sincerity. So this antorikota, he used to use this word very often. Sincerity and earnestness. They sound the same, probably the other is vyakulita. So this tremendous longing for God, and to be sincere. I often think that what does it mean to be sincere? It's a very subtle thing, that we say things and is it really from the depth of our heart? The Bengali word that's used is the same antar that they use for the heart. Does it come really from the depth of our heart? Do we really feel it? Is it something that it may be true, but how true? We think true, is it true? There shouldn't be any degrees of truth. But if we say to someone, I love you, to what extent is it true? And how deep is that feeling of love? And when we say, I want God and God alone, and we say, okay, I want God and God alone, but I'd also like to have this and that and everything. How sincere are we when we say these things? So it's very good to pray for sincerity, because the mind is naturally a little bit self-deceitful. We fool ourselves sometimes. Sincerity is a question of also how much do we really know, that we can tell ourselves things. We can be insincere with other people, also with ourselves. We can convince ourselves that we're very honest people, we're very good people, and we're very modest people and humble people, and deep down we're hiding the fact that we're happy when people praise us and when people love us and all of that. So the sincerity, a very important thing, if we can really, and this is one of the reasons I think that Thakur talks about going into solitude. When we're all by ourselves and no one is observing what we're doing, and we're not doing it for the sake of anybody else, we can feel that we're doing something sincerely and with some type of intensity. So sincerity and earnestness. With these, one can realize God. And then he says, through all religions, it doesn't matter what path. It doesn't matter if we're devotees, if we're jnanis, anything. The Vaishnavas will realize God, and so will the Shaktas, the Vedantas, and the Brahmos. Then, this was the incredible thing about Thakur. For just some village priests from out of the way village to be so liberal and open-minded. The Muslims, that means Muslims, and Christians will realize him too. All will certainly realize God if they are earnest and sincere. Some people indulge in quarrels, saying one cannot attain anything unless one worships our Krishna, or nothing can be gained without the worship of Kali, our Divine Mother, or one cannot be saved without accepting the Christian religion. Now remember that Thakur is talking to the Goswami now. This was the one thing that Thakur didn't like about this tradition, that sometimes they were a little one-sided, and they felt that you have to worship Krishna if you want to get liberation. Of course, the Shaktas also could be one-sided sometimes, and they quarreled quite a bit. The Vaishnavas and the Shaktas, whether to worship God as Mother or to worship God as Krishna. So he's saying this for everybody's sake also. He says, this is pure dogmatism. The dogmatist says, my religion alone is true and the religions of others are false. This is a bad attitude. God can be reached by different paths. Then sometimes Thakur will say, there are mistakes in every religion. And by mistakes, he doesn't mean really mistakes, but there'll be some things that are a little bit superstitious. There'll be some statements that are too one-sided, that are too fanatical, that we shouldn't think that everything that we find in our tradition is perfect and everyone should believe in it and agree to it. He's very, very liberal this way. He even says the scriptures. We generally think, scriptures, that this is sacred. How can we say anything against them? He says, no, that there may be a little sand mixed in with the sugar. And you have to know, you don't have to criticize the sand, but leave it there. Take the sugar. Be like the ant. If some sugar falls and gets mixed in with some grains of sand, the ant has the ability to go, and they're so tiny, and just take the granule of sugar, put it in its mouth, and leaving behind the granule, the sand. So he said there'll be mistakes in all religions, or there'll be things that we can just leave alone. And we have to know, that we have to use the powers of discernment to know which things we should take and which things we should leave behind. Everybody thinks their watch keeps the right time. Huh? He says that. And then he adds sometimes, nobody's watch can be, we can be certain keeps the right time. You have to check it against the sun. It's a very interesting statement. That means that everything that we say will be our description of this ultimate reality, which will be more or less okay. But we have to keep checking, like an artist who's making a painting has to keep looking at what he's painting to make sure that he's not getting his imagination or getting it wrong. Keep checking there. So, yeah, I think about this with time. This is a very curious thing that how do we determine what time it is? Huh? We have some clocks that are supposed to be the ultimate authority, there's atomic clocks or something like that. But if we think about the whole concept of time, that it's all based on the position of the sun, right? So if we're standing 2 feet away, our time is different. Do you ever think about that? Your watch says 12:01, my watch says 12:01. No. It may be a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a second difference, but the sun, of course it's not the sun moving, but it appears that the sun is moving. It may be directly ahead for me, 12 o'clock, and for you it'll be a tiny bit off. So really it's the sundial that is correct. But the sundial, once we go and try to put a number on it, then again we're in trouble. If we look at just the shadow and say that's exactly the time, because that's determined by the sun itself. So everything we say about what is the real nature of Brahman, that's trying to determine exactly how do we measure the length of that shadow, but the shadow itself is the actual truth of it. Some of you may remember slide rules. When we were kids we had slide rules. Now there are some numbers that this is really off the subject. I don't know why I get into it. But there are some numbers that, what do they call them? Imperfect, or that they can't, like pi, they're, or non-finite numbers, integers, something like that. I don't remember what they call them. Prime. Huh? Prime. No, not prime numbers, but Or take for example, if you want to know the length of the hypotenuse of a triangle, that you square the two sides and add them together and take the square root of that. And very often it's a square root that doesn't have a finite number to it. It'll go on and on and on and on. But the length of that is exactly the length of it. Even though you can't put a number on it, you say, what is the length of it? You simply have to take it and show, so this is exactly the length. But we can't put a number on it. So this Brahman is what it is. The reality is what it is. How we can describe it and everything will be limited by our whatever tools we have to do it. Further, some say that God has form and is not formless. Thus they start quarreling. A Vaishnava quarrels with a Vedantist. Now, I mentioned many times that in Thakur's mind, when he says Vedantist, he means a non-dualist. And when he says a Vaishnava, he means a dualist here. So this will be the dualists, or qualified non-dualists, that they'll quarrel with the non-dualists. One can rightly speak of God only after one has seen him. He who has seen God knows really and truly that God has form and that he is formless as well. He has many other aspects that cannot be described. Once some blind men chanced to come near an animal that someone told them was an elephant. They were asked what the elephant was like. The blind men began to feel its body. One of them said the elephant was like a pillar. He had touched only its leg. Another said it was like a winnowing fan. He had touched only its ear. In this way, the others, having touched its tail or belly, gave their different versions of the elephant. Just so, a man who has seen only one aspect of God limits God to that alone. It is his conviction that God cannot be anything else. Now, we may say, but God is formless, infinite, absolute. How can there be aspects to it? We've seen before, Thakur very often uses this illustration of water. Yes, water is formless, but it can take an infinite number of forms, depending on the container that it's in. So in the same way, we can say that this infinite absolute reality, which is homogeneous, this is one, there's no internal distinction, and yet it can manifest in so many different ways, and according to the heart of the devotee, can even reveal itself in so many different forms. Okay, let us stop here. Om Niranjanam Nityamanantarupam Bhaktanvakam Bhathura Vikraham Vai Ishavataram Parameshamedhyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namama. We bow our heads before Sri Ramakrishna, who is stainless, of infinite nature, whose heart melts in sympathy for his devotees, who is an embodiment of the divine and the Supreme Lord, and ever worthy of our worship. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.